One more quick resource to share with you all is I want to do, although we've covered, I think, most of the vocabulary words, and I've sort of paused and stopped to explain, I believe, each of these vocabulary terms at one point during the prior four lectures. What I want to do is just spend 10 or 15 minutes making sure each of you have a solid understanding of what each of these vocabulary terms mean by actually pointing out these elements on from slides from the lectures that I've lectured from to date. So I'm going to bring up two lectures, which I think should have each of the terms. And the PDF of the vocabulary terms is available in the files folder. Should be available to each of you. You should have already downloaded it by now and kind of been reviewing it as we've been going along. But in case not, go grab it now. It's important for you to basically be using these terms on the exams. That's your proof to me that you understand what these terms mean, and you can use them in the proper context architecturally when you're describing the work. So I'm going to start with the first term, which is fluting. And I'll just read the definition there. Fluting is the vertical decorative treatment of a column, often carved away from the surface. Fluting is a very easy one, and this is a really good example in Alberti's church here at San Sebastiano, which is basically the fluting effect, the sort of carving of the detail as you work your way around the surface of the column. That's the fluting. So that articulation, basically accenting the verticality of a column shaft, the middle portion of a column, is considered the fluting. You might see fluting on a column. You might see, and these are actually pilasters. These are not columns. They look like columns, but they're pressed up against the building, which by definition makes them pilasters. So you could see pilasters, or you could see fluting on a pilaster. You could see it on a column. You might even see fluting in an entablature and other places. Anytime you see kind of vertical banding or carving into a material, in fact, you might refer to this, the door jamb detail, as having a fluting detail in the jamb. So that's fluting. We'll stay here for the second term. The second term is entablature, which is the upper portion above the architrave beam. And that's the term. It was a slide, not in the last lecture finishing Alberti, but in the first lecture on Alberti's work. I remember I got hung up on the portion directly below the frieze in the entablature, and that's the term that I was blanking on, which is the architrave. The upper portion of the beam above the architrave beam that contains the frieze, the corbel bands, the mediope, the triglyphs, and the cornice, but not the roof. And in fact, let's go to Santa Maria Novella. That's a better example. Perfect. So here, the entablature is the upper portion above the architrave beam. That's the architrave beam that comprises the roof, the gable. I'm sorry. That contains the frieze, the frieze, the corbel bands, the mediopes and the triglyphs, which are this detailing here, the egg and dart pattern, and the cornice, but not the roof. So this in its entirety would be considered the entablature. The pediment, so actually we'll stay here as well, is the piece that stacks right on top of the entablature. So the pediment is the portion above the entablature that comprises the roof and the gable end where the tympanum is found. So this is the tympanum. Broken pediment. Let's stay with Alberti here. Perfect. We'll stay with the first one. So the broken pediment is the splitting or separating of the triangular element that makes up the gable end of a roof structure which ordinarily rests on top of the entablature. So at Santa Maria Novella, we see a complete whole pediment resting on top of the entablature. Here at San Sebastiano, we see a broken pediment. We see that triangular piece sitting on top of the entablature having been split into two components. Another common broken pediment is oftentimes you'll see a pediment that has kind of a circular relief at the top, a negative space at the top. That's also a broken pediment. Basically, anytime the complete triangle is broken in any way, whether it's split, whether there's a missing piece at the top, whether there's a missing piece at the bottom, as we see here, it's considered to be a broken pediment. Barrel vault. So this is a really good example of a barrel vault. It's a vault or a ceiling space created forming a half cylinder, usually supported on either end by walls or columns. Pilaster. So we've talked about pilaster quite a bit. There's a pilaster, there's a pilaster, there's a pilaster. It's a rectangular column that projects partially from the wall to which it is attached. It gives the appearance of support, but is only for decoration. Portico. A portico, let's go back to Brunelleschi. So a portico is an enclosed porch supported by columns, walls, and a roof leading to the entrance of a building. So the enclosed porch supported by columns, walls in the back, and a roof leading to the entrance of a building. Colonnade. So we can stay here, and this can be considered to be both a portico and a colonnade. Colonnade is a long sequence of columns joined by an entablature, as they're joined here, and a roof, and set apart from the exterior walls of a building and defining a circulation or a semi-protected outdoor space adjacent to the building. Another place would be the cloister that we looked at the left-hand side and the right-hand side at Santa Maria Novella is defined by 4 colonnades, which are basically lines of long sequences of columns which are joined by an entablature and a roof. Okay, biforum windows. We've seen lots of biforum windows. Here is a good example of a biforum window. A biforum window is a window opening that's been divided vertically into 2 openings by a column or a pilaster. So it's basically 2 openings that are set within what looks like a single opening that was originally designed. So you see another biforum window there, biforum window there. At not Castle Vecchio, but Palazzo Vecchio is another good example of having biforum windows. Pointed arch. Here, Santa Maria Novella has a good example of a pointed arch. A pointed arch is an archway opening, a window, door, or a decorative element with 2 vertical edges, a spring point at both sides, beginning an arch to connect both with a defined point at the center top of the arch, differentiated from a classical arch or an elongated arch. So a pointed arch has 2 vertical edges and an arch that springs at the same point on both sides, but rises rather than it being a semicircle. They rise such that the circle actually continues this way and continues this way, and those two are intersected by a point. So it's not a complete rounded semicircle like you see here, but rather a semicircle and a semicircle that are actually crossing one another, not necessarily meeting at the center, and that creates a point at the very top. So that's a pointed arch. Clear story window. Let's see where there's a good example of a clear story window. So these would be considered clear story windows. These would be considered clear story windows. They're windows that are at the upper section, the upper level of a building. They could be horizontal, they could be vertical, but they basically clear the primary story of a building. So if this is considered the primary story of the building, this is kind of clearing or an upper is in a section beyond the primary story. These are at an upper section beyond the primary story. Those are clear story windows. Upper part of a facade or a wall, typically clearing above the entry level piano nobile and admitting light from a plane above down into the space below. We'll stay right here for the next one. Tholobate. Tholobate is the upright part of a building upon which a dome is raised, typically rising taller than the main roof and located at nave and transept crossing. Perfect. Nave, transept, crossing. We have here the octagonal tholobate at Santa Maria del Fiore, which the dome rests on top of. So the tholobate is essentially, and actually there's a couple examples of tholobate here. There's a primary tholobate, but there's even a secondary tholobate here. It's basically the drum upon which the dome sits. All'antica. This is a perfect example of all'antica. So all'antica is a term you've heard me use in the lectures to date, which is a Latin term meaning after the antique. It made in reference to classical antiquity of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the phrase that framed the motivation of the Renaissance artists and architects. So all'antica is basically what all Renaissance architects, artists, musicians are trying to do, which is basically take us back and pay homage to or make reference to the classical antiquity of the Greeks. Give us new, but have that newness, the creativity of the newness, founded in the classics. Lukovica you can skip. That's going to become relevant as we start getting into the architecture of Asia, starting really on Thursday after the exam. So you can skip that term, Lukovica. You can actually skip opus mixtum. That'll become relevant with some of the Russian architecture we're going to look at. The next term is rustication, which is to build or face with usually rough-surfaced masonry blocks having beveled or rebated edges, producing pronounced joints of a rusticated facade. And a good example is Palazzo Medici Riccardi. Here is a perfect example of rustication at the lower level of this building, which is basically rough surfaced, rough edged stone masonry. And here made very obvious by juxtaposing that rough, coarse, rusticated stonework with smooth, clean, kind of what looks like maybe machined. I mean, obviously, it's all done by hand, but by contrasting the amount of craftsmanship that goes into creating the kind of sort of smooth, more refined modules of stone here against the rusticated facade below calls even more attention to the detail of the rustication. So that's rustication. Trabeated. You've heard me use this term a lot. It's basically the look of a building as though it's supported by columns and beams. Whether it is or not, it can look trabeated. This is a good example. This is a solid load-bearing wall and a solid load-bearing wall, but that's not how the building looks. It looks as though this entablature is supported by this vertical column, this vertical column, this vertical column, and this vertical column. In fact, as we know already, those are not columns, those are pilasters. But the building still has a trabeated effect or a trabeated look, which is that it looks as though the verticals are supporting the horizontals. Quattrocento is, can't really use a picture to point out quattrocento. It's basically a term that denotes the 1400s. It literally means the 400s, which may also be referred to as the 15th century, and is the beginning of the Renaissance period. And the last three, but not least, are three important terms that you should by now probably have committed to memory. And I use this slide to introduce the terms to you. And they are the I'll just use them kind of in sequence: the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. In this image here, or in this slide, you're looking at them from range of simplicity to complexity, from left to right. Here is the Doric order. It is the most simple. You will sometimes see the Doric order with fluting. Sometimes you will see it without fluting. But especially when you kind of keep sort of this center of this image in your mind, whenever you see the detail and the articulation of either the volutes or the agantha leaf kind of profile of the springing of the sort of organic plant-like upper detail, whenever you see that level of detail work, you know you're not looking at a Doric column. You're either looking at an Ionic or a Corinthian or a composite column. So I've always thought of the best way to identify a Doric column is there an absence of detail? If I see an absence of, maybe not absence of detail, because there is still detail here, but if there's an absence of a high level of articulation, I know I'm not looking at a Corinthian or an Ionic. And really the other giveaway for me are the volutes or the scroll profiles. If I see the scroll profiles, I know I'm looking at an Ionic column. And if I see something that looks highly decorative and highly articulated, I know I'm probably looking at either a Corinthian or a composite order. So just remember the Doric as being the most simple. Common in mainland Western colonies. The Hara Temple at Paestum. So this is actually a reference from the Arch15a class. So you can also even understand that the Doric has presence even in sort of prehistoric architecture. 6 columns along the short axis, 14 along the long axis, 1.5 to a half. 1 to a 5.5 proportion. So 5.5 tall to 1 wide. Columns rise directly from the stylobate, broad, round capitals, and fluted shafts. Sometimes fluted shafts, not always. That's the Doric order. The Ionic order is common in the Aegean Islands and Asia Minor. Temple of Artemis is a good example of that from 550 BCE. So again, also has precedent in prehistoric architecture. Slender shaft with greater number of flutes, volutes, 3 undecorated corbelled bands at the top, a continuous frieze cornice with dentils. So that's the Ionic order. Again, the most common thing about the Ionic order are the scrolls. And then the Corinthian order, common in the Aegean Islands and Asia Minor, Temple of Artemis, Ephesus, 550, 8 columns along the short axis, 20 along the long axis, a 1 to 9 proportion. So 1 to 5.5, 1 to 9, 1 to 9. Slender shaft with greater number of flutes, volutes, 3 undecorated corbel bands, continuous frieze cornice with dentils. So Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. For what it's worth, because the slide shows it, and I've explained it on some of the projects where these come into play, but the Romans took basically the classical orders given to us from the Greeks and added this one, which is the composite order, which basically combines the Doric and the Ionic. And then they added the Tuscan, which is an even more simpler version of the Ionic order. And really, the base is where the simplicity of the Tuscan order is really most obvious in relation to the Doric order. Okay, so those are your vocabulary terms, just kind of a short review. Use the vocabulary terms that we've gone over in this lecture on the exam. I want to see you using these terms, putting them into use, and using them in the proper context. Thank you.